At exactly 12 o'clock noon on the 22nd of April, 1889, the population of Guthrie, Oklahoma, was 0. By sunset, it was 10,000 people. No gradual settlement, no slow build, no years of growth. 0 to 10,000 in a single afternoon. And some of those 10,000 people had been waiting in the bushes since the night before. This is the story of the land rushes, the most chaotic, violent, legally insane, and genuinely extraordinary method of building cities that any government in modern history has ever attempted. Today we are going to look at how it worked, who cheated, how they got caught, what they built, and why most of it is gone. Welcome back to the Western Archive. This one is a little different from our recent episodes. Less blood, more chaos, which is, honestly, its own kind of exciting. If you are new here, subscribe. We make documentary deep dives into the real history of the American frontier every day. And if you have been here a while, thank you. You already know what we do. I want to start with a comment prompt right now. Have you ever heard of the Oklahoma land rush? What do you actually know about it? Drop it below, because I am willing to bet this video adds something you did not know. Let's find out together. To understand the land rush, you have to understand the legal system that made it possible. And that system starts with Abraham Lincoln. In 1862, the same year Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act that would build the Transcontinental Railroad, he also signed the Homestead Act. The principle was straightforward. Any eligible citizen could claim up to 160 acres of public land. In exchange, they had to live on it and improve it for 5 years. After 5 years, it was theirs. 160 acres, for free, for showing up and staying. The problem, by the 1880s, was that most of the available land in the West was either already claimed, controlled by large ranching interests, or classified as Indian territory, land set aside by treaty for tribes that had been forcibly relocated from the eastern United States. A movement of settlers called the Boomers had been lobbying the federal government for years to open those Indian lands to white settlement. They organized, they petitioned Congress, they staged illegal incursions into Indian territory and were repeatedly removed by the Army. In 1889, under the Indian Appropriations Act, the government did what the Boomers had been demanding. It took approximately 2 million acres that had been assigned to the Creek and Seminole nations, land that had been promised to those tribes permanently, and declared it open for settlement. President Benjamin Harrison set the date. Noon, April 22nd, 1889. The rules were simple. Line up at the border. When the signal fires, go. First one to a parcel of land and drive a stake with their name on it wins. Then register the claim at the nearest land office. The land is yours. Simple rules. Enormous territory. 50,000 people. And a starting gun. The morning of April 22nd, 1889, the border of the unassigned lands was lined with approximately 50,000 people. On horses, in wagons, on bicycles, on foot. Some of them had been waiting in place for days. The government had designated special trains to move settlers into the territory, moving at roughly 15 miles per hour, the approximate speed of a running horse. The thinking was that this would give everyone a fair start. The thinking was wrong, but we will get to that. At noon, the signal came. Some accounts say it was a pistol shot, others say a cavalry bugle. What every account agrees on is what happened immediately after. 50,000 people moved at once. The noise was described by witnesses as something between a thunderstorm and a stampede. The dust cloud was visible for miles. Horses collided, wagons overturned, men on foot were overtaken by men on horseback, and then overtaken by wagons, and then passed again by men who had started sprinting before the signal and were not stopping for anything. Within hours, not days, hours. The prairie had been divided into claimed parcels. Streets were being marked with rope and stakes. People were selling water out of buckets for 5 cents a cup. By evening, Guthrie had 10,000 residents and the beginnings of a municipal government. By evening, Oklahoma City had been similarly transformed from empty grassland into the foundation of a city. 1 month later, Oklahoma City had 5 banks and 6 newspapers. This is what 50,000 people and a starting gun can do to an empty plain. Now, about those people in the bushes. The land rush had one critical vulnerability built directly into its design. The rule was that you could not enter the territory before noon, but the territory was enormous, 2 million acres. The Army had 2 cavalry regiments to patrol the entire border. Some people looked at that situation and made a calculation. They were called Sooners, from the phrase, sooner than they were supposed to be. In the days and nights before the official start, they crossed the border in the dark. They hid in creek beds, ravines, stands of trees. They waited. When the bugle sounded at noon, they emerged from cover and drove their stakes into ground they had been sitting on for hours. To anyone watching, it looked like they had simply arrived very fast. The cover stories, when challenged, became remarkable acts of improvisational fiction. One elderly man was discovered on a plot of land with onions already growing 4 inches out of the ground. His explanation was that the soil of Oklahoma was so extraordinarily fertile that the onions had grown to that size in the 15 minutes since he arrived, having ridden from the border on, and this is documented, what he described as the fastest oxen in the world. Nobody believed him. The onions were evidence he lost the claim. But not all Sooners were so easily caught. The most difficult cases involved people who had legal authority to be in the territory before the race. Deputy marshals, railroad employees, land surveyors. These individuals were permitted inside the borders before the start, for official purposes only, with explicit prohibition against staking claims. Dozens of them did it anyway. They identified the best lots in the future city of Guthrie before the first legitimate settler had crossed the line, and they planted their stakes in those lots while acting in their official capacity. When the race began and the crowds arrived, the choicest parcels in town were already taken by the people who were supposed to be preventing exactly this. President Harrison's proclamation was explicit. Anyone who entered the territory before the appointed time would be permanently barred from claiming land under the Homestead Act. Not temporarily, permanently. The result was hundreds, eventually thousands, of legal disputes that worked their way through local land offices and eventually into the United States Department of the Interior. People who had ridden as hard as their horses could carry them, only to find their chosen parcel already staked by a man with a government badge, spent years in litigation trying to get what the race had promised them. The phrase that circulated in the tent cities of those early days was 160 acres or 6 feet of ground, land or a grave. The atmosphere was not symbolic. The government's own officials cheated the land rush, and the men who were supposed to stop them were the ones doing it. Did you know about the Sooners? Drop it in the comments. And if this channel is giving you something genuinely new, subscribe. It makes a real difference. Let us talk about what those 10,000 people in Guthrie actually built, and how they built it so fast. The answer is not what you might expect. They did not build well. They built quickly, and the technology of rapid frontier construction was more sophisticated than it looks. The false front. The defining architectural feature of every boom town in the American West is something called a false front. You've seen it in every Western film ever made. The flat, tall facade rising above a building's roofline, making a 1-story wooden shack look like a 2-story brick building. The false front was not laziness. It was a rational economic strategy. Here's the calculation a business owner made when arriving in a new boom town. The land might be worthless in 6 months if the boom collapsed. Investing in a stone building was too expensive and too permanent for an uncertain situation. But arriving with a canvas tent and a hand-painted sign looked like exactly what it was: temporary, unreliable, not a place to conduct serious business. The false front solved this. Build a cheap wooden frame, attach a tall, flat parapet above the roofline, cover it with materials stamped or painted to resemble stone or brick, pressed tin, cast iron architectural details ordered by mail, paint applied to mimic masonry. The resulting building looked from the street like a solid, permanent structure. It was not. It was the visual language of stability applied to the cheapest possible construction. And crucially, that tall, flat face was an enormous billboard. In a new town with no established reputation, the sign on your building was your entire identity. The false front gave you the largest possible sign on the smallest possible budget. Prefabrication and the kit home. The false front got you looking like a city. The kit home got you living in one. The prefabricated house market had existed since the California gold rush of 1849, when thousands of portable homes were shipped around Cape Horn to San Francisco. By the time of the Oklahoma land rush, the system had matured considerably. Companies, eventually including Sears, Roebuck and Company, offered complete home kits delivered by railroad. A kit could contain up to 30,000 individually numbered pieces. The buyer received the pieces, the plans, and the instructions. With a crew of several men, a basic structure could be assembled in a matter of weeks. No architect required. No lumber mill required. No specialized knowledge required beyond the ability to match numbers and swing a hammer. The federal government had also done something clever before the race even started. Military engineers had been through the territory in advance, driving survey stakes and dividing the land into the abstract grid of the Public Land Survey System, a federal coordinate network that turned every square mile of the American West into a numbered section on a map. Speculators in eastern cities had already purchased maps of this grid with lot numbers marked. When the starting gun fired, many settlers were not simply running toward any available land. They were running toward a specific lot number they had identified in advance, in the same way you might navigate to a specific address. The chaos looked random. Underneath it, there was a coordinate system. The false front was a lie made of wood and tin, and it built the visual identity of the entire American West. Did you know what was actually behind those facades? Write it in the comments. This is the history underneath the history. Now we need to talk about the other side of this story. Because for every boom town that became a city, there were 10 that became ghost towns. And the process worked just as fast in reverse. Frontier towns were built around a single economic justification: a mine, a railroad junction, a cattle drive terminus, a government land office. Remove that one thing, and the town had no reason to exist. And on the frontier, that one thing could be removed with startling speed. When the mine ran out. Mining towns were the most vulnerable. Virginia City, Nevada, which at its peak in the 1870s had 30,000 residents, deep shaft mines, and had installed electric lighting before most American cities, collapsed when the Comstock silver lode began to thin out. The machinery stayed, the buildings stayed, the people left. What remained was a preserved cross-section of a prosperous mining city, frozen at the moment the money stopped. This is how ghost towns are made, not by destruction, but by abandonment. The buildings do not fall down immediately, they just empty. When the railroad changed its mind. Railroad towns were almost equally fragile. A junction town that grew because 2 lines met there could be gutted overnight if a company decided to reroute one of those lines.
The railroad did not need to ask permission. It did not need to notify the town. It just laid tracks somewhere else. Entire communities watched the economic foundation of their existence move 10 or 20 miles away, and understood immediately what it meant. Some followed. Some stayed and tried to reinvent themselves. Most simply thinned out over years, until the remaining residents were too few to maintain the infrastructure, and the infrastructure began to decay around them. When the cattle stopped coming. The cattle drive towns, Dodge City, Abilene, faced a different kind of death. The open-range drives that filled their streets with cowboys and their economies with money ended not through any single event, but through technology. Barbed wire, patented in 1874, allowed ranchers to fence their land. The expansion of the railroad network meant that cattle could be loaded closer to where they were raised. The long drives from Texas to Kansas became unnecessary. Dodge City did not disappear.
But the version of Dodge City that the world has romanticized, the wild, chaotic cattle terminus with a dozen saloons and a permanent population of gamblers and drifters, was gone within a decade of its peak. What replaced it was a quieter, agricultural town that looked nothing like the mythology it had already generated. The town that lasted 3 months. The most extreme example of this cycle was Benton, Wyoming. Built in the summer of 1868 as a hell-on-wheels settlement following the Union Pacific Railroad construction, Benton had 3,000 residents and every amenity a frontier town could offer: saloons, gambling, a post office, businesses of every kind. It existed for 3 months. When the railroad moved on, Benton was disassembled, loaded onto flat cars, and reconstructed somewhere else. The site was empty by the end of the year. No ruins, no foundation, just the flat Wyoming plain where 3,000 people had lived and conducted commerce and died and been buried for a single summer season. The Oklahoma land rush of April 22, 1889 was the first of several. More races followed in 1891, 1892, 1893, and 1895. The largest was the Cherokee Outlet Race of 1893, 6.5 million acres distributed in a single afternoon to over 100,000 participants. The system eventually destroyed itself. The combination of Sooner fraud, claim-jumping violence, and the impossibility of fairly adjudicating the resulting disputes convinced the federal government that the race model was unworkable. Later land distributions switched to lotteries and auctions, slower, less cinematic, considerably less chaotic. The territory of Oklahoma became a formal territory in 1890, and the 46th state of the Union in 1907. Guthrie was its first capital. Oklahoma City took that status in 1910, and when it did, Guthrie's economy contracted sharply. A city built in a day lost its central purpose in another political decision and felt the loss immediately. There is one thing worth saying plainly before we close. The land distributed in the Oklahoma land rushes was not empty land that had been sitting unclaimed. It was land that the United States government had assigned to the Creek and Seminole nations under treaties described, in the language of those treaties, as permanent. The tribes had been removed from their original homelands in the southeastern United States and resettled on these plains on the explicit promise that this land, at least, would not be taken. That promise was broken. The land was reclassified. The race was held. And the speed and spectacle of the rush, 50,000 people, a bugle call, the extraordinary creation of cities in a single day, obscured what had been done to make that land available. The word Sooner, which began as a legal term for a cheater, is now the official nickname of Oklahoma's state residents. The university's sports teams use it as a rallying cry. The negative meaning was absorbed and transformed within a generation. That transformation is also part of the story. The land rush was the most American thing the American West ever produced. Not because it was heroic or just or well-designed,
It was none of those things. But because it combined genuine possibility with systematic fraud, extraordinary human energy with deeply human dishonesty, and the thrill of something genuinely new with the erasure of something that had existed before. 0 to 10,000 people in an afternoon. False storefronts made of tin pretending to be stone. Old men with mysteriously fast-growing onions and the fastest oxen in the world. A city that lasted 3 months and left no trace. Another city that lasted 130 years and hosts 1 million people.
This is what the frontier actually looked like. Not the clean mythology, the whole thing. Which part of this hit you hardest? The speed of the rush? The sooner cheaters? The false front architecture? Or the ghost towns? Tell me in the comments, and share this one if it gave you something new. That is genuinely how this channel grows. Subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next one. Stay curious.